Greetings, everyone. This is Professor McKenzie. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 52, which is International Law. The learning objectives in this chapter, I want us to be able to understand the concepts of sovereignty, self-determination, failed states, and failing states. I want us to also understand sources of international law, and so we're going to be looking at different treaties, conventions, and customary international law forms. We'll also look at how civil law disputes between parties from different nation states can be resolved through national court systems or through arbitration, as well as understanding well-recognized bases for national jurisdiction over parties from other nation states. So that's our overall kind of like objective as we go through this chapter. So in terms of understanding the role of international law in the context of business operations, when a company enters into an agreement with another entity, whether that be another business, another government, another organization located elsewhere in a different nation, part of what you have to kind of consider is, well, which country's laws are going to govern the transaction? So should there be a dispute of some kind? Ideally, whenever you enter into a contract, you want it to go as planned. Everyone does what they say they're supposed to. Everyone does what they say they're going to do and do what they're supposed to do. But we know that that's not always the case. And so when there is an issue that arises, we have to be able to kind of say, well, this agreement is going to be enforceable under this national body of law. And then through contract, you can voluntarily kind of select any country to apply their laws in the agreement. If you're a business, let's say here in Florida, so part of the United States, and let's say you're transacting business with, let's say, a company that's in France, you can obviously choose and negotiate, that choice of either applying U.S. law or French law. If you and the other party are skeptical of, maybe, or you can't agree on one of those two choices, you can even pick a third choice. You could say, well, if there's a dispute, we'll apply German law or we'll apply Brazilian law. So there's a lot of flexibility, as we approach agreements in terms of like the forum selection and the law to be applied. How and when will disputes be resolved? That's another type of question that you would potentially negotiate over. As this indicates, this slide at the very bottom, normally in most modern commercial transactions that are international, the preferred kind of mechanism for resolution is binding arbitration. Even if you end up losing an arbitration, it's quick, it's inexpensive. You really don't want to litigate, if you're a business, if at all possible. Because even if you're litigating here in the United States, it takes a long time. From initial filing of a complaint to the point where you get to maybe presenting your case in court in front of a jury, that can easily be at least a year or sometimes longer. And by that time, you would have moved on and done something completely different, with that issue. So arbitration definitely is the preferred form of resolution because, again, as I said, even if you end up losing, it's fairly quick and it's inexpensive, the process. The other issue to consider is that when you are dealing with international transactions, what's going to be the denomination or the monetary unit you're going to use in that agreement? Again, you can agree to anything. So if you are dealing with a French company, the French company is probably going to want to use the euro, which is obviously their standard or unit of currency. You as a company here in the United States would prefer US dollars. And so you would have to negotiate that, and so, whatever side is willing to make some kind of a concession, that at the end of the day, that's how you would resolve that particular dispute. But again, you can see the challenge because, it's like, well, that's a transactional cost. If you are going to agree to, let's say, receive payment in euros, that's fine. But you also have to kind of consider, well, what is going to be the cost of converting those euros into the US dollar? We don't necessarily know what the exchange rate is going to be, weeks, months, or even longer out. And so you would have to kind of factor that in your overall price structure. The last thing you want is to think you're going to be earning a profit And then, when it comes time for contract execution and the other party pays you, you end up, either breaking even or losing money because of currency valuation issues. So, you want to try and avoid that if at all possible. When considering how to structure, going into international markets to sell products or services, you essentially have three main levels of options. At the very top of the slide, it says export sales. And so that's usually the easiest way to kind of dip your toe, so to speak, in the deep end of the water when it comes to global transactions. If you're manufacturing or you're providing a product or service, from Florida, and let's say you have customers that are in South America, you can just, export your particular products to them. And that's a fairly simple thing to do. It doesn't require you to have any physical presence in South America. You don't have to even travel to South America in order to do that. You can containerize things and just ship them. And so it's a fairly easy, low risk environment. The problem with export sales is that you probably are not going to enjoy the potential for higher profits because of the limited nature of that transaction. Your next kind of like step or entryway into international transactions would be maybe to establish either like a distributorship network or maybe through principal agency law or through licensing and franchising, having some kind of presence in those other countries. So with this kind of like escalated entrenchment in a foreign market, you're definitely going to have to travel there for this level of activity. And so there's going to be some investment in time and travel and in forging some unique relationships so that you have locals in other countries who are going to be, kind of like, the face of your company on a local level in those other jurisdictions. And so, again, you're increasing risks there because, there's going to be more investment, there's going to be more time, there's definitely going to be more, legal factors to take into consideration. Hopefully, though, because of that greater investment, you have the higher potential for reward through profits. That's the theory anyway. The final level, which is at the bottom of this slide, is the greatest level of entrenchment for a company when they're going overseas to do business. And that's where you're either creating a wholly owned subsidiary, or maybe you're going into what's called a joint venture. And so different countries have different policies when it comes to foreigners or foreign entities that are coming into their country to set up shop, so to speak. Some countries are okay with you coming in and you buy land and, you build a building or structure, either, construct it or you buy an existing structure and then you open your business. Some companies are very amenable or open to that. Some parts of the world, because of, maybe prior experiences with corporations, they're a little bit skeptical of, other companies kind of coming in, and the concern is exploitation, either of their people or of resources. And so some countries will have requirements for what's called a joint venture. And so that's where you have to partner with a local, whether it be an individual or a business in this other country, and then jointly you run the operation in that country, whatever that particular business is. Either way, this represents the greatest level of investment and entrenchment in a foreign market, but hopefully this also reflects the greatest potential reward, and what I mean by that is profitability by this. So, as with anything in life, there's always, pluses and minuses. But this is the range of options that are available if you're a company and you're seeking to go outside your nation in order to do business. You can simply export, you can create like a distributorship or license or franchising model, or you could go to the deepest level of engagement, and it could be like a wholly owned subsidiary or maybe a joint venture, depending on what that national law permits. We've done a lot of efforts since the end of World War II to advance a more modern, globalized view of commercial transactions. When I'm making this video right now, Russia has invaded Ukraine, And we've seen the Western powers, Europe and the United States and Canada in particular, kind of come down very hard in terms of trade sanctions on Russia. And so, this is the modern kind of embodiment and reflection of what the Allied victors in World War II, this is the world they wanted to create. So, at the end of World War II, just to give you some historical context and then tie it into current events, we saw, like, in the early part of the 20th century, we had World War I, and then within about 25, 30 years, we had another World War. And the Allies after World War II, we knew we couldn't go through this cycle of every few decades, having, basically another world war. It was a tremendous loss of life, tremendous loss of resources, and we wanted to try and figure out how can we, pull countries together so that they're more cooperative with each other and less likely to wage war. And essentially, two theories or two approaches emerged, and both were kind of fully implemented. So one kind of prong or approach was the United Nations. So let's have a diplomatic venue in which countries can come together from the world, and they can air grievances, they can work in cooperation to try and improve relations among the global community. Now, you can agree or disagree with the success of the United Nations, but, it's still around. It's been around since, the end of World War II. And, it has been instrumental in trying to forge alliances among different countries of the world. The greater strategy and the other prong is essentially globalization. The idea that if we can encourage as many countries as possible to trade with each other, the more entrenched you are with other countries in terms of like trading partners, you're less likely to go to war with them. You're still going to probably have issues. I mean, that seems like hardwired into our species. We'll have conflict of some kind. We'll disagree with others. But, are those conflicts worth risking the loss of that economic activity that we currently are experiencing? To give you a modern example, think of the relationship right now that exists between the United States and China. China does a lot of things that we really don't like, and we do a lot of things that China does not like. But there is no other relationship, that is so economically intertwined and interconnected as our two countries. So, if you're the United States and, you're thinking, well, okay, do we want to wage war with China? You are risking basically one of the largest suppliers of all the goods that we purchase, or a lot of the goods, I should say, we purchase in this country. And so there's no other country currently that has the production capacity to satisfy the desire and the thirst we have for material things. China is just there. They produce so much. Likewise, for us, we are the best customer China has. There is no other region of the world that has the consumption and the spending power of the United States. Europe doesn't even come close. Even though Europe is a modern, region or part of the world, the countries that comprise Europe don't have that consumerism that we have here in the U.S. So for China, they just can't say we're going to stop selling to the U.S. and we're going to go sell elsewhere. There's not enough market activity in South America, Africa, Asia, other parts of Asia, Middle East, that can kind of compare with our consumptive ability. So even though we tend to not get along with each other on many types of issues, we overall will get through it somehow. We'll muddle through and we'll kind of cooperate with each other, because the alternative is, we could, end up in a much worse situation economically, and that also is true for China. So the theory of globalization, even though it's an odd kind of approach, it works. It really does work. Tying it in with current events with Russia and Ukraine, we're seeing that, the more countries of the world that are on board with globalization, we can really crack down on countries that don't want to be cooperative and get along, with their neighbors. And so, it's a very effective strategy, when you think of imposing trade sanctions, imposing embargoes, denying, access to markets, restricting, monetary transfers from country to country, seizing of assets outside of a country for the leaders of the country in question. There's a lot of tools at our disposal and other members of the global community to try and make sure that, we as countries, as sovereigns, will play nice with each other. So again, this is exactly the world that the Allied victors at the end of World War II. This is the world they envisioned, that we would be more cooperative, that we would trade with each other, and then we would work together to kind of build up, country by country, and elevate the standard of living for people, and hopefully in the process reduce the likelihood of war, even though, obviously we still do have war, unfortunately, at times. So the original organization that was created to kind of advocate and further global trade was GATT. That's General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. By the 1990s, that morphed into now what is referred to as the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. And the theory here is that if you're a signatory country to GATT, or now WTO, whatever trade concessions or tariff concessions you give one country, you give to all countries that are signatory to this agreement. And so again, we're promoting and advancing global trade. We've also seen different economic integration examples that exist in the form of like unions or free trade agreements. So the European Community, for example, initially that was the European Economic Community, and it eventually kind of morphed into now the European Union. And at its inception, the idea was, on a regional level, meaning for Europe only, how can these countries prosper by trading with each other and giving each other, more trade concessions than they would maybe to the rest of the world. And eventually, by like the late 90s and into the 2000s, you see the EU, actually most of the members abandoned their individual currencies in exchange for a new common currency called the euro. When I grew up, like the Germans had the Deutschmark, the French had their francs, the Italians had the lira as their currency units. And I never thought that, you would see countries willingly give up their monetary unit in exchange for a greater unit that covers multiple sovereigns. It would be like here in the United States if, we have a free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. And imagine if our three countries gave up our currencies in exchange for a new unit of currency. Maybe Mexico and Canada might be on board with that, but I know here in the United States there would be a lot of pushback to abandoning the dollar in exchange for some kind of new monetary unit. But that reflects a deep commitment for the members of the European Union, that they are, in solidarity with each other when you are abandoning your currencies in exchange for having a common currency cover all those unique markets. Speaking of the free trade agreement here in North America, originally the free trade agreement existed just between the United States and Canada. That was the US CFTA. And again, with any type of union or free trade agreement that's based on a region of the world, the idea is that we're trying to increase trade for whatever countries are member or signatories to that agreement. By the 1990s, the US CFTA was expanded to include the country of Mexico. And so originally in the mid-90s, when that became part of our body of international law, it was referred to as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The previous administration, required some modifications for that free trade agreement, as well as a name change. And so now it's the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement. And again, same purpose. We're trying to eliminate any type of barrier for trade among our three countries. Now, the free trade agreement that we have here in North America is a little bit different from the European Union, in that the European Union does allow for the free movement of people, and so for us, we have not gone quite that far. We still have border, controls, so that, we want to try and regulate the flow of people that come into the U.S., whether it be from Canada or from Mexico. But conceivably, there might be a day where the free trade agreement in North America is expanded so that we eliminate any type of restriction on the free movement of people, so that if we want to move to Mexico or to Canada, we can freely do so, or vice versa. Um, that would tend to blur the lines of what we consider to be national sovereignty. But who knows if that ever is going to be, kind of like an extension of the USMCA. But for the European Union, they've done that, so that if you're in Italy and you want to move to France, you can move, or to Germany. You don't need to get like a visa or special permit. And it's certainly not without controversy. It certainly isn't without some growing pains, as we allow people to kind of freely move and be mobile across national boundaries. But again, you kind of see maybe this is part of the evolutionary process of the nation state, that eventually this is what is going to happen in other parts of the world, possibly. Not all free trade agreements are for, the expansion and promotion of trade. OPEC, for example, I have at the bottom of the slide. That's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And even though the United States, is a producer and an exporter of oil, OPEC, for the most part, they operate under this idea that they want to regulate the production and output of oil so that they can kind of maintain a certain price range per barrel of oil. And sometimes they even try and restrict output so as to reduce supply and increase price. Again, that isn't necessarily always in promotion of economic activity, especially when they're trying to do things to increase the cost of oil. When we're comparing and contrasting tariffs versus non-tariff barriers, tariff is simply a tax on goods as they move in and out of a country. And historically, this has been one of the more common ways in which we try and regulate the flow of goods across national boundaries. So that every country of the world has experimented with this in some level, even the United States, where we want to raise the tariff on goods that are coming into the U.S. so that we make it more expensive to buy foreign-made goods or products, and have it be cheaper to buy domestic or U.S.-made goods or products. And so we've done that from time to time. It's not usually the most sensible policy when you think in a macro sense for industry, because you're tweaking with the natural price of goods and or services. But again, a lot of times the imposition of tariffs, it tends to be more of a political decision. It's not necessarily done because the country needs revenue. It's done that countries are trying to protect certain industries. Non-tariff barriers are trade restrictions that are not tariffs, so it's not necessarily a monetary-based restriction, but it includes some other dimension. So it could be a reduction in the number of goods that can come into a country. So we can say, we could tell Japan, with regard to, let's say, Toyota vehicles, we can numerically restrict the number of vehicles that they're allowed to ship into the United States. That would be like a quota, an import quota. You could have an embargo, so think of like North Korea, currently Russia, or even like Cuba or Iran. We have a lot of policies in place that greatly restrict the ability for individuals or businesses to trade with those countries. And again, usually an embargo is done because of political reasons, not monetary reasons per se. There also is the instance where you could have as like a form of export control because of foreign policy, and we see that usually with military or high tech industries. So that think of the products that we create that have that are instruments of war. So tanks, missiles, weapon systems. And even like in the high-tech industry, when you think of certain forms of like computer systems or even software, we want to restrict access outside of our country to only those countries that we are allies with. And we don't want it to get into the hands of someone that could possibly use those weapons against us. So sometimes there are restrictions that are put in place over goods or services. And again, it has nothing to do with money. It has to do with trying to protect national security interests. An example in terms of how we restrict the flow of goods into other countries because of military concerns. The national government has what's called a Bureau of Export Administration, and so this agency oversees the exportation of any type of good that's made here in the United States. And one example of what they have is they have what's called a commerce control list. And here, this is a listing of types of industries and products and countries that if you want to ship, the identified goods or materials to a different country, you have to essentially secure a license. And so I give the example here. There's a weapons grade steel that we produce here in the United States, and if a company wants to sell this weapons grade steel to, let's say, Canada or maybe to the United Kingdom or France, that's going to probably be okay. I mean, you need to get a license for that, but that usually is not going to reflect any type of national security issue. If you want to sell it to, let's say, Pakistan or maybe some other country that there's more of a concern in terms of it getting out of the control of the country that's trying to procure it, then that would be something that would be very challenging or maybe impossible to get a permit or a license in order to ship it to those regions of the world. So again, you kind of see what the different perspectives and the interest we have. Sometimes we're trying to protect our own kind of like businesses that exist here in the United States. Sometimes we have a greater interest when it concerns, let's say, national security. When it comes to governmental regulation, we mentioned in Chapter 32, we talked about intellectual property, and I didn't discuss counterfeit goods versus gray market goods, but this is kind of like an overlap with that chapter. Counterfeit goods, as you could imagine by the very label, these are goods that are fakes. They're knockoffs. And so, if any of you have been to, like New York City, you know that on street corners, you'll see vendors or merchants, that are selling things that look like, they could be a genuine, like a Rolex or some other kind of like luxury good, but they're selling it very inexpensively. And the reason why it's being sold so inexpensively is that it's a counterfeit good. It's fake. And so, obviously, it's an example where, police can arrest or, they can shut down these operations, but as soon as they shut down one, two more pop up. And so it's a never ending kind of battle trying to kind of police these things to eliminate the sale of counterfeit goods. Gray market goods is an interesting phenomenon. It's been happening more in recent years. The idea with gray market goods is that if you have a global brand, a lot of times brands will kind of have geographic markets where they will tweak or tailor goods that are sold for the taste and preferences of different regions of the world. So if you're Gucci, and let's say you're making handbags, you will have different designs, different materials, different, types of, methods of fabrication for your designer handbags. And, you'll have some that are designed for the taste, the material, color preferences of, let's say, the South American markets. And then you'll have, another, design, different colors, styles that are designed for Asian markets and for European markets and North America and Africa and so on. The idea with the gray market good is that, you have goods that are in a designated territory, and that's where they're supposed to be sold. But for some reason, they end up in the wrong territory or geographic region. So maybe, Gucci sends, their kind of like their summer line of handbags, a huge batch to South America. And let's say within like a few weeks or months, they start seeing these bags appear in European retail outlets. That's a gray market issue in that they're not counterfeit. They're actual licensed, goods. It's just that they're not permitted to be sold in a non-approved market or region of the world. And so this is where, if you're, the manufacturer or the trademark owner, so Gucci, you need to figure out, well, where did this mistake occur, and you need to fix it. And it's just it's a problem of, maybe someone in the distribution chain thought they could, make a quick sale by selling it to a different region of the world. But again, you as a trademark owner, you get to control where stuff is sold. And so you get to kind of say, well, no, you can't sell it in these other markets. You can only sell it in the designated market that we have chosen for you. When we're looking at jurisdiction, because again, how do we determine, where do we bring cases? The United States, do we bring it in this other country? What are we looking at? There's different standards that U.S. courts apply. So there's something called the effects doctrine, and so if something is happening in a foreign country, if it has a substantial effect, and that's a very vague, judicial term, on the U.S. market, then U.S. courts can assert jurisdiction. The idea is that, if it's somehow, even though it's occurring in a different country, if it's impacting, maybe a certain market significantly in the U.S., we can have the case be heard here in the United States. Ideally, though, you want to bring a case where, whoever the infringers or the wrongdoers, you want to bring a case where you can go after their assets. If it's maybe there's an illegal production in Mexico, but maybe if the party is in question is located in the United States, you could go after them because they're physically here, or maybe they have offices here. If you're dealing with some type of infringing activity, counterfeit activity, whatever it is, and everything is just offshore, well, you're going to be kind of limited. You're probably going to have to go to that other country. Otherwise, you're just hopefully, trying to get customs to intercede and prevent those goods from flowing into the United States. So, and that could be, again, that's a tough proposition because so much commerce flows in and out of the United States on a daily basis. Some defenses that companies or parties might have, active state doctrine. So, courts are not going to judge another government's acts as long as they're doing that within their own country. Sovereign compliance, that's more of an affirmative defense. If you were basically kind of being compelled by a foreign government to do something in that other region of the world, then that would be a defense you would have if you're being sued here in the United States. And if you're the last one there, the sovereign immunity defense, if you're actually trying to sue, let's say, a foreign government, the U.S. is this way also. Normally, you can't sue the government unless the government gives you permission to sue them. Here in the U.S., as an extension of British common law, the idea here is that, the crown, so to speak, would not let you sue the crown unless the crown gave you permission. And that's a tradition and a legal concept that still exists here in the United States. So if you want to sue, Orange County, the state of Florida, the U.S. federal government, there has to be either an acknowledgement that you're allowed to sue, or there has to be some statute that permits and enables you to sue whatever the level of government is in question based on the cause of action you're asserting. Relief mechanisms, excuse me. So if you suspect that maybe there's dumping that's occurring, and so this is where you have maybe a company or a government outside the United States that is artificially lowering the price of a good and shipping it into the U.S. in order to hurt domestic-made production, then what you can do is you can request, we have what's called the U.S. Trade Representative, and that person has a lot of autonomy in being able to potentially retaliate against these companies or countries outside the United States, and either take corrective action in terms of pricing, so like the imposition of maybe a tariff on a specific case-by-case basis, or other types of policies in order to kind of counter the dumping effect that is countries are trying to do. When we're looking at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, this is a unique body of law in the United States that normally any type of law, usually it's only operational and enforceable for the country that enacted it. And the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is an exception to that. And so obviously here in the U.S., we're not allowed to bribe government officials or anybody as an inducement to contract or to get some kind of benefit or arrangement. There are countries of the world where, bribery, whether they call it that or they label it something different, but functionally it's bribery, is okay. And it's not against a law in other countries necessarily. We as U.S. citizens, and by extension, this also includes U.S. companies, even if we're doing business in a region of the world that permits bribery, we are not allowed to engage in bribery. If we do, we can be punished here in the United States for doing that. The author, I think, mentions the case of Ralph Lauren. Ralph Lauren, one of their kind of like subsidiaries that was in Argentina years ago, engaged in bribery there. And Ralph Lauren, they did what we want companies to do. They discovered what had happened, and then they self-reported to the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they were in total, cooperation in terms of the investigation that ensued. And so even though they did pay a fine, in terms of as a penalty, that's what we want companies to do. The last thing you want is, the DOJ or the SEC to kind of discover that a bribe occurred and you tried to kind of conceal it, because then you're really going to get hit hard in terms of sanctions or penalties. But again, just as, as a matter of course, if you're a U.S. citizen or if you're a company from the U.S. and you're doing business outside the U.S., even if other competitors in other parts of the world are engaging in bribery, you are not allowed to do so. The last slide that I have for this chapter is expropriation. And this is a concern that, companies have, that if you are, doing some kind of like wholly owned subsidiary or joint venture, some other operations in a different country, the concern that, maybe the government or someone within, that kind of, sovereign will seize control of your business operations and take it from you. And a lot of times that's going to be without compensation. And so there's different ways in which you can try and address the issue of expropriation. You can secure insurance. There's insurance companies that'll insure just about anything. So that's one potential option. You could screen countries better. Obviously, different parts of the world, there's different levels of risk when it comes to expropriation. If you decide you want to open up business in, let's say, the United Kingdom or France or Italy, there's minimal risk there for expropriation. But if you're going to, a country, part of the world that maybe, they're struggling and emerging as maybe a fledgling democracy, you might have trouble, there kind of having a stable reliance on the rule of law, and that your company is not going to be subject to expropriation. The U.S. government for U.S. companies, does offer, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation some options when it comes to, protections from expropriation. But again, careful country selection and an understanding of the risk assessment is really essential when you're trying to determine, is it worth it or not to expand operations in other countries. So this has been Chapter 52. Let me know if you have any questions, but I appreciate your time, and I look forward to chatting with you again in our next chapter. Have a wonderful day.